We're picking up again in Genesis chapter 37. If you have your Bible, we'll be in Genesis 37 today. A couple weeks ago, we began looking at the life of Joseph, which is going to be the entire last 13 or so chapters of the book of Genesis. And so today we're in the second half of Genesis chapter 37, verse 12. So as you get there, I want to talk about something that I think we all deal with from time to time. It's anger. You know, Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry and do not sin. And that is a very challenging thing to do. I don't know the last time you got really mad. Remember, it was maybe it's at your spouse, usually, right? Your spouse is the one who can make you the maddest. Maybe it's at a coworker, right? Coworkers have a tendency to drive us crazy from time to time. If you're a child, maybe it's at your parents. Parents, maybe it's at your child, right? I mean, but the last time you got angry, you're just seeing red. Logic ceases to be. And then we remind ourselves that in our anger, we're not to sin. And we say, how can that be? Almost every time that I have said something that I regret to my spouse, it has been due to anger. I have been upset, and I keep my emotions fairly level. I don't know how many of you know me well enough to know, I don't get, hopping mad real quickly. It'll take a lot to get me there, but when it happens, it's not good. My dad was a man who would get angry easily, and so I watched that in my house. I grew up underneath an explosively angry environment at times, and I always told myself, I'm not going to be that. And so I kind of went the other way, where I'll bury it all down deep and hope that I can process it before it explodes out like a volcano. But there are times when it just does. And then out of my anger, I say things that I would never say in my cool head. Out of my anger, I do things I would never do in my cool head. It is truly a losing of my mind at times when I live in anger. The Bible tells us anger is something that we will experience, and it's possible to be angry and yet not sin. How can we do that? Well, we're going to look a little bit at anger today with looking at Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers were embittered towards Joseph. You were here a couple weeks ago. You remember Joseph's brothers hated Joseph. Joseph had these dreams of his brothers bowing down to him. Joseph was favored by his father. His father gave him a coat that said, this guy doesn't have to do any work, right? And he's my favorite. He not just kind of had a favorite of his 12 sons. He had a very clear favorite. Joseph was that favored child. And living in an environment where one child is favored over the other, living in an environment where that brother that you already have animosity towards due to your father's treatment, that brother has dreams saying you're going to bow down to him even though he's younger than you, even though he has no right to feel like that, leads to resentment. And unprocessed resentment and anger leads to sin. This is what we see in Joseph's brothers' story here, picking up in verse 12 of Genesis 37. The word of the Lord says, now his brothers, Joseph's brothers, went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I'll send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, what are you seeking? And he said, I'm seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. So this is not the first time that Joseph has been asked to go and check in on his brothers. Jacob, also known as Israel, has trust issues with his older sons. They are unreliable workers. Early on in the Joseph narrative, we get Joseph bringing a bad report on his brothers. That leads them to hate him even more. Likely they were acting the fool while supposed to be about their father's business. And because of that, Joseph came back and said, hey, this is what these guys are doing. They're not honoring our family name. They're behaving in a way that's shameful. And because of that, right, because they behaved like that, Jacob, their dad, got mad at them. And so they're off at Shechem, supposed to be working for the father again, pasturing his flock near Shechem. And he says, hey, why don't you just go check on them to make sure they're doing their business like they're supposed to do. And sure enough, they were not. They're supposed to be in Shechem. They're supposed to be in the vicinity of Shechem. Joseph goes to Shechem, and he's just out wandering around in fields. I do not see them wandering around in fields. Wander around long enough that a guy walks up and says, hey, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for my brothers. They're supposed to be here. He said, oh, I saw them. They were here. They've gone on somewhere else. They moved somewhere else. They, again, weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So Joseph goes to find his brothers. Now, Joseph is being set up in a way that he doesn't fully understand. Jacob, the father who loves him, is setting him up in a way that he didn't understand because Joseph's brothers didn't just dislike him. They didn't just feel a tinge of disgust whenever he spoke. They actively harbored anger and hatred towards him. And they allowed that anger to fester for a period of months or years. We don't know. Time is not specified exactly here. But for a lengthy period of time, they allowed that anger to fester in their hearts, and they really despised him. And so him being that far removed from his father's protection, that far removed from the family estate in Hebron, put him in a very vulnerable position with the only people in the world that actively hated him. Right? There was probably no one else in the world that had a hatred for Joseph. Joseph is sent to the 11, or probably 10, Benjamin's unlikely to be there to be fair, but his 10 older brothers who actively despise him. He finds them where they're not supposed to be, and we pick up in verse 18. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal's devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben, the eldest, heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let's not take his life. Reuben said to him, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, so that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There wasn't any water in it. Joseph comes wandering up, and while he's still a long ways off, his distinctive coat and his walk gave him away. And the brothers are gathered together, and they see the brother that they hate, and for some reason, they conspire at that moment to kill their brother. They may never have even really actively pondered killing their brother, but there is something about group dynamics that causes people to act in ways they would not act individually. Right? When you go to a Little League baseball game and there is a 16-year-old umpiring the game, a 16-year-old kid getting paid $30 to come out and umpire a game of 10U baseball, he did not wake up that morning to strike your kid out on ball 4. But you can't convince yourself of that in that moment when you're in the crowd of people who have a shared life experience. Y'all are there together to support your team to win, your kid's team to win. And so parents say things at Little League games that they would never say to that 16-year-old if they were alone. I hope. Right, I hope. Group dynamics is weird. You go to a football game and one person kind of yells at the referee for something, and then in 2 minutes, the entire crowd is yelling about that exact same thing. I went to a game, where was it? It was Lorena. I went out to the Lorena game this year, and I forget what the ref was doing. Maybe he was starting maybe it was the clock operator. I don't know. They're yelling at somebody. And one guy starts to yell, and sure enough, it just kind of filters through the whole crowd. And I'm kind of sitting there, and I'm like, oh, group dynamics at play. These 10 brothers gathered together, see Joseph from afar. And here's one of the things about anger, guys. When we take our anger and we don't resolve our anger, we don't process our anger, we don't work through our anger, and then we live it in a shared experience of other people who have a reason to be angry, we can fall prey to mob mentality to do things we would not do individually. You need to be careful when you're angry about how you move to processing this. It's not to say that you can't talk to people. You probably need to talk to somebody when you're angry, but you need to talk to the right person. We can talk to the right person. There are people in our lives who love drama. I don't understand them. I want less drama in my life, but there are some people, if you tell them, I got cut off on the highway, they're like, let's go find their car and slash their tires. And you're like, let's do it, right? You've gone to the wrong person. There's people who just love, they just get involved. They're like, man, let's do that thing. And so I don't know which of the brothers saw Joseph from afar and it's like, man, I wish I could kill him. And then someone else is like, yeah, we could kill him. Hey, we could kill him. Hey, we're out in the middle of nowhere. Dad's not anywhere around. We could literally kill him, toss him in a pit, and say an animal killed him. This is perfect. And all of a sudden, this little conversation that never would have happened individually, if one of them had been alone in their anger, likely would not have occurred because of the group dynamic at play. Right, they conspire to murder their brother. Reuben, the eldest, it seems like he's kind of always walking back into the story. And so Reuben, I don't know where he was. Maybe he was actually with a sheep at the time. But he walks back up and they're like, yeah, let's kill him, throw him in the pit. He's like, whoa, hold on a second. That sounds a little bit severe. We probably don't want to be guilty of murder, right? I've got to compromise. Let's just toss him in a hole. He'll die of exposure, but it won't be our fault, right? Like, we didn't actively kill him. So, like, that's we're innocent of his blood. The brothers say, that sounds good. We don't have to get our hands too dirty. We can just toss him in a hole, and everything's going to be fine. Reuben's ultimate plan, though, was to try to win back the good graces of his father. Reuben had already committed some fairly heinous sins against his father, and I'm sure his father had a great deal of dislike for Reuben. And so if Reuben brings home the favored son, he's delivering this person back and maybe, like, gets his position reestablished with his dad. That was his plan to do that, and sure enough, they take the coat off, they throw him in the hole, and imagine Joseph in the bottom of this hole with his rage-filled brothers above him, yelling out, help! Help me! Help! Guys, I don't know if you noticed, but you dropped me in a hole. Help me out! Pick me up! Pull me out! Somebody help! Help! And he's just crying out, you imagine, right, from the bottom of this hole, and what do his brothers do? Verse 25 says they sat down to eat, right? What a weird response to committing a fairly violent crime that will lead to your brother's death. They're like, man, I could go for a sandwich right now. And Joseph is yelling in the hole, not far from them, and they're just eating up and having a good old time, talking about how things are going to be. And as they sit down to eat, verse 25 says, they looking up, they see a caravan of Ishmaelites. These are just some traders out there coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah, the fourth oldest brother, said to his brothers, you know, what profit is it if we actually kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our own hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him, and so the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, and they lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and then they took Joseph to Egypt. The Midianites took Joseph down to Egypt. So they're sitting down for their lunch after they've performed a wicked deed. They see these Ishmaelites, and Judah has this idea, which anger leads us to live in a very selfish state. This is one of the consequences of living angry, is that we live pleasing ourselves, our base urges. And all of a sudden, he's like, guys, we could make some money, right? Like, we could walk out of here with a couple extra dollars, and we don't have to, like, listen to him crying anymore in the hole and conceal his blood. Like, we can just sell him. And these guys are heading down to Egypt. He'll be a million miles away as far as we're concerned. We won't ever have to see him again. He won't be our problem. He'll probably die in 10 years in slavery anyways. He's not our problem. We can make some money. And the brothers all are like, yeah, that sounds good. And so they sell him for 20 shekels of silver. That's the price of like a wounded slave, right? So they didn't even value him as like an able-bodied slave. They valued him as a kind of a worthless slave. And that's probably like indicative of the fact that they haven't seen him work probably his whole life, right? I mean, he's just been living the favored life underneath his father's hand. But in their anger, they decide, first we're going to kill him. No, we should just toss him in a hole. I don't know, let's sell him and we'll make some money. Right? Because ultimately it takes care of problem one, which is we hate this guy and he's gone. And it takes care of problem two, we have $20 more in our pocket. And so they sell their brother for $20, and those Midianite traders take him down to Egypt. And guys, here's what the brothers don't know, right? And maybe if you're not familiar with the story, maybe what you don't know. Joseph had to go to Egypt. That's where he needed to be. Right? Providentially, God needed Joseph to be in Egypt right about this time. And the brothers didn't recognize that. The brothers were acting selfishly in anger. But we have a God who providentially is working even through wicked acts. It's not to say that you can do wicked things to make God fix it. Right? Like, well, I can do anything I want and God's just going to make it right. No, a lot of times when you do wicked things, like the consequences of that is absolute destruction. There's no, like, not every cloud has a silver lining. Sometimes they're gray all the way through. But in this case, Joseph needed to be in Egypt. He didn't know that yet. His brothers didn't know that yet, but the Lord did. And so they took him down to Egypt. Reuben, again, walked away. He missed the whole sell my brother into slavery conversation, apparently. He goes back to the pit where his brother's supposed to be. The pit's quiet. He looks down in the pit, and this is what we pick up in verse 29. Reuben returned to the pit, saw that Joseph wasn't in it. He tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and he said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Right? This boy is gone. I'm responsible for him as the oldest. Where shall I go? What can I do? And so what did they do? They took Joseph's robe. They slaughtered a goat. They dipped the robe in blood. They sent that robe of many colors and brought it to their father. And they said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not." And he identified it, and he said, "It is my son's robe." A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, put on sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all of his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol." That's the grave. "I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. I will die in this mourning," is what he's saying. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So the brothers, Reuben comes back, realizes that Joseph is gone, asks the brothers what happens, obviously gets the rundown. We've sold him, we got $20, it's a pretty good deal, right? And Reuben laments this fact. His plan to rescue his brother, to regain favor with his father is gone, and says, "What do I do?" And so what they do is they fake his death. Take that coat that they'd taken off, tear it up a little bit, dip it in blood, give it to their dad, and let their dad draw the conclusion. Right? Did they lie to their father? I mean, by omission, right? But these guys are not the most moral, upstanding people, right? They don't say, like, "Hey, this is goat blood," but they let him look at it. Say, "Is this your son's?" "Yes." And then Jacob comes to the conclusion, a wild animal must have killed my boy. And then he goes into this deep period of mourning. Guys, here's the other thing about anger. First of all, like anger in group dynamics is a dangerous thing. You need to be careful who you share your anger and frustration with if you're living in some sense of bitterness, right? The second thing is that anger creates in us a desire to serve our selfish needs. We live selfishly when we live in anger. The third thing, though, is that when we act in anger, when we live in anger, and we act sinfully in anger, there are consequences that are more far-reaching than you imagine when you behave like you do. If you explode at your wife, if you scream at your wife and you berate your wife, and then at the end of it you say, "Oh my goodness, that was wrong of me," and you go back to your wife and you apologize and you try to make peace with that, that doesn't fix everything. The damage spirals out from there. You know, if you have children in the home, that what they're witnessing and the way in which their father is treating their mother, right? That it continues. And we have generational sins that come. Sometimes kids pick up the sins of their father, and they're culpable, they're responsible for their own sins. But they're walking the path that was led to them by their father or by their mother. Guys, like these boys did not seek out to harm their father's soul. I don't really understand why they aren't more bitter with Jacob than they are. Their anger is fully dedicated to Joseph. Right? They want Jacob to be comforted in his mourning. But they didn't recognize that when they took Joseph from their family, while it solved their immediate desire problem, it had consequences, negative consequences for their family that they didn't see. Guys, anger blinds us to the consequences of our actions. And so what do we do when we're angry? How do we process our anger? Well, the first thing is we need to recognize like anger is a natural emotion. You are not made to never get angry. You can be the calmest person on earth. Again, I put myself on a list of calmer people. I'm fairly phlegmatic, and then my wife will drive that out of me sometimes. No. There was someone that we knew, and my wife's like, man, that guy is the most laid-back guy on earth. And I was like, he's not more laid-back than me. Competition, right? See how uptight I am? Well, he's not more laid-back than I am. I'm chill. But we've watched as years have gone by, and we've known this man long enough. You know what we've realized? Like that same thing that's in all of us, that anger, that temper that can jump out of nowhere. Like we see it in him. Even that guy who she thought was more laid back than me. God bless her for thinking that. Right? Like it's in us. That's okay that you're an emotional person, that you have feelings that come across. What's not okay is to live in bitterness and resentment and allow your anger to fester in your heart. Because you cannot control it. You can't. You can't harbor it and give it a home. And sometimes when we're angry at someone, it feels good to hold on to that. Gives us a little sense of control and power in a situation where maybe we were disempowered once upon a time. Maybe we're holding on to things that our dad did to us, 40 years ago. And it kind of feels good to hold on to that because it gives us a sense of moral superiority, a sense of like, hey, I'm better than. But it's a guilt. It's not a guilt. It's a bitterness. It's a resentment. And guys, I want you to know when you hold on to those things, you're harming your soul. Right? If you're a believer here today, you have been forgiven a great debt. A debt that you can't fully understand. Like the sins that you committed that you can remember. But I can't categorize every sin that I've committed in my life. I mean, I can't. It is a crazy long list. I'm often reminded of Bruce Almighty, and he goes to the little file cabinet, and he opens the file cabinet, and it pushes him across the room like, 100 yards, right? And he's like, this is just from today, right? And it wasn't talking about sins there because that movie's not going to get that theological, but like that's my file cabinet of sins. And while I may remember a word that I used in a conversation that maybe I shouldn't have, I may remember an act that I performed that I shouldn't have, like I can't fathom the depravity that God has had to witness in my life, yet Christ still died for me. And guys, I live forgiven by Jesus Christ of a great debt that I don't I don't deserve to be forgiven of. And because I live in that forgiveness, and because I have some sense of what that forgiveness is, some sense of the enormity of my debt that Christ paid on the cross. Guys, we can't hold things against other people when Christ is releasing us of our debt. That's not to say that you don't have reasons to be angry. I think most of us, we have people. I mean, honestly, a pastor of mine years ago said, if we were honest, if everyone was honest in this room, right, there would be a story on every pew that would break our hearts. Some of you have been betrayed by those who were supposed to care for you. Right? You've been manipulated by people who said they would love you forever. You've been done wrong by business associations. You've been robbed. Maybe you've been beaten. none of that is okay. None of that is acceptable. But guys, when we hold it, we allow that little anger just to be our pet that we hold inside of us, you need to know you won't ever control it. And the thing that you think you're accomplishing, the power that you think you're maintaining by holding on to the anger, by giving a place for the resentment in your heart, like that thing that you think that you're getting by holding it is really slowly corrupting who you are. And that thing that you hated about that other person, the thing that damaged you, that this other person did to you, the thing that you're rightly angry about, you'll find yourself doing similar things to the people that you love. Because the anger will spill out, it will explode out, and the people that are closest to you are going to receive the damage. My wife, who I love, right, she receives more damage from me than any of you ever will. And some of it's damage that I should have been given to you. That's just the truth. There are things like sometimes, like individual people in this church and in my life, right? Just sometimes. And usually I don't throw it back at you because I'm shove it down deep. And then my poor wife, overcooks the toast or whatever. That's not true. We don't eat much toast, right? Then she gets just the worst of me. She's like, what did I do? I don't deserve this. And until I come back to my senses, I can't even see it. I think she deserves it when it's happening. And then, I may come back to my mind and be like, oh, crap. I was really dedicated for Zach Rowland. I don't know why, but there. That's not true. I don't think I have anything currently against you, Zach, but I'm working on it. Guys, we can't harbor it because it comes out and it's not a pet. Be angry and don't sin, Ephesians says, but ultimately it says don't let the sun go down on your anger. In the moment where your anger comes and flares up, you can't stop it. Don't give it a home. Joseph's brothers gave it a home. They kept it as a pet, and then when they got the group dynamic element added in there, they performed in ways that absolutely was destructive. Guys, don't do that. Live in the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. Today you're forgiven by the blood of Jesus Christ, so extend that forgiveness to others. You don't have to forget what they did. You don't have to trust the person ever again. In fact, oftentimes you shouldn't trust them. When someone tells you who they are and they show you who they are, you can believe who they say they are. But you don't need to hold it. Is that, I don't know if it's Les Mis or something, right? Maybe Count of Monte Cristo. Those two stories, for some reason in my mind, go together, even though they're not similar at all. I don't know why that is. But, it's the idea of resentment, harboring resentment is drinking poison and hoping someone else will die, right? This resentment that we hold inside of ourselves. Right? It's just harming us. So guys, I'm going to encourage you today to let that go. If you've been forgiven by Jesus Christ, let it go because you know you've been forgiven a debt bigger than what you held against you. And if you don't think that your debt is larger than the thing that you're holding against your mom, your dad, your wife, your brother, your coworker, whatever, I want you to go back to think about what you've done to your Savior. Come to a right understanding of that and then begin to let that stuff go. Joseph's brothers couldn't do that. They behaved in a way that was simple. Does God make beautiful things out of messes? Sure. But sometimes those messes are just absolutely gross. Guys, I'd encourage you not to make a mess in your life. One day I want to stand over you, and you'll be laying out in a nice, pretty steel box, and you will be going down to the grave. One day I'm going to stand over you. And not all of you, some of you are younger than me, and you'll stand over me. But one day when I stand over you, it will be clear the legacy that you left. The people behind you, the story behind you, the wake behind you is clear. Guys, I want that wake behind you when you don't have any more breaths on this side of the veil to be one that ultimately points glory back to God. How could you forgive him for that? How could you forgive her for that? How could you possibly do that? Let me tell you about my Savior. We forgive because we've been forgiven. Live as forgiven people today. Let me pray.